What I want to do today is talk about two follow-up studies of youth activists that I've done at very different stages of my career. The work on Freedom Summer, I was putting the finishing touches on that particular project 25 years ago. Shocking, though it seems. I tracked down all of the people who applied to take part in the Freedom Summer project, at least all those I could find. This was in the mid-'80s, and followed up with them at that time. Freedom Summer, for those who don't know, this is 1964. 1,000 primarily white Northern college students were recruited to go to Mississippi to try to register black voters. Mississippi being what it was in 1964, very few blacks were registered that summer, but it turned out to be a very important campaign in the civil rights movement, and a very dramatic summer. 4 of the volunteers died that summer. Very important event, not just in the civil rights movement, but really in the kind of full flowering of the 60s activism. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that was one follow-up study. And again, what I was interested in looking at was the long-term effects of either going or not going to Mississippi on the subsequent lives of those who had applied. And then much more recently, although this is now 9 years ago that I did the Teach for America, or started the Teach for America study, I followed up and studied all those who had been accepted to the Teach for America program in years 3 through 7 of that program. And again, I'm assuming you guys know what Teach for America is, although Ohio is one of a handful of states that does not allow Teach for America teachers in the classroom. So it remains something of a controversial program within educational circles. That's not my interest in doing the research. But again, what I was looking at here was the longer-term civic impact of taking part in the Teach for America program. The two studies are actually very much related in practical terms. The founder and still president of Teach for America, a really remarkable woman named Wendy Kappa, she designed the blueprint for Teach for America as her senior project at Princeton, and then graduated and said, I think I'll actually build it. And she basically put this organization together in the early 90s and has been running it for 20 plus years. Really quite remarkable. She read Freedom Summer and called me up and said, oh my gosh, the kind of life-transforming power of the Freedom Summer experience is what our alumni experience, or what our graduates experience. Would you do a study? Would you do a follow-up study? And I had a lot of things I was working on, and I said, well, kind of what's your time frame? And she said, well, our 20th anniversary comes up in 6 months. It'd be great if you could finish it by then. And I said, well, there's no way the kind of study I'd be interested in doing, I couldn't do in 6 months. And I put her in touch with somebody who did kind of organizational focus groups, and they pulled alumni together, and they filmed these ringing testimonials to the life-transforming power of the Teach for America experience. And I thought everybody was happy. And I couldn't get the idea of a serious follow-up study of their applicants, not just the graduates, but applicants, out of my head. And so I went back to her a year or two later and said, you know, I really would like to do this, but I would need the cooperation of the organization to try to track people down. And they were extraordinarily gracious and helpful in facilitating the study. Then got funding support for it, and spent 2 years trying to track folk down. 3 groups of subjects, I'll talk more about them later, but graduates, those are individuals who accepted the position, teaching position, and fulfilled their 2-year teaching commitment. Dropouts, they accept a position, but they don't complete the 2 years. And then in some ways the most interesting group are non-matriculants. They're offered a position, but they don't take it. So the follow-up study is of those 3 groups, and I'll share results with you sort of down the road. What I want to do, again, as the slide indicates, is very quickly kind of revisit the results from the previous summer study, present some findings, much more detailed findings from the Teach for America research, and then speculate a bit about what might account for the very real stark difference in the enduring effects. These findings could not be more different. And in general, what I want to use the talk to do, the stark difference in these findings, is to challenge this widely held assumption held by academics, by educators and policymakers, that youth service invariably changes people, has big effects. It's the justification behind service learning, behind sort of number of required hours of community service to graduate from high school, etc. There's a widespread assumption that if young people engage in service, it makes them citizens. It has enduring civic effects. And I think the reality is much more complicated, that the longer-term effects are wildly variable. And instead of assuming generic effects, we ought to expect that variation and really be interrogating the experiences or comparing the experiences to try to identify those factors and dynamic processes that may account for the difference in the longer-term effects. You follow? If we're really interested in kind of promoting long-term engagement, civic engagement, we have to be more critical about the nature of the projects or the nature of the experiences and what aspects of those experiences may be producing the longer-term effects. So that's what I'm going to do. Why should we care? Well, this work is now, Bob Putnam's work is invoked all over the place. Bob is a good friend and colleague at Harvard. And Bob's, in my view, stimulated this incredibly important debate, which has sort of died down a bit, but has raged for about 15 years, by suggesting that social capital in the United States is in decline. And what he means by social capital are bonds of trust, kind of routine interaction among citizens in society, neighbors, etc. And he created quite a stir 15 years ago or so with this bowling alone agenda, the research he did on bowling alone. And again, his argument was that social capital in the U.S. had declined fairly precipitously over the last 30 or 40 years. And Bob really didn't care whether people were bowling alone. What he really cared about was the viability and vitality of American civic life. And he argued that when social capital is kind of robust, it facilitates civic life. And when it declines beyond a certain point, it undermines the routine bonds of trust and interaction on which civic life depends. Follow? So very interesting debate. I was involved in some of that debate with Bob and others. But even at the time the debate was going on, I thought too much of it was kind of backward focused. That is, there was a lot of criticism of Bob's data, wondering whether he was using the right data to make the case. And the other part of the debate was simply an argument about what the real trend looked like. So those who felt Bob was wrong in his assessment of what had happened to social capital in the United States since, say, the 60s or 70s, argued that he missed important new developments, new forms of community beyond bowling, they would say. And that, so there was an argument about what the real trend was and whether his data had picked it up or not. But that was all kind of a backward-looking debate. And it seemed to me that beyond worrying about where we had come from, it was important to try to identify the kinds of social processes that, in fact, promoted social capital. That if social capital is really in decline, and I think Bob, in general terms, is right in his account, then shouldn't we be concerned about trying to identify the kinds of social processes that promote the development of social capital and restore the vitality of American civic life? Among the experiences that are widely assumed to promote civic engagement and generate social capital is service. That's where this assumption comes in. Well, if you want to replenish social capital and make citizens, then we need service requirements, voluntary youth service requirements. We need to demand that our students in high school engage in service. So again, there is this, around this same time that this debate was going on, there was a lot of talk about the need for young people to be to engage in youth service, youth activism, because surely that would replenish the stock of social capital and help to revitalize civic life in American society. Teach for America believes this and has made it an important part of their program. So this, I forget where this is coming from. This is their application packet from way back in 1999, which was one of the years I was looking at. So they say explicitly, Teach for America has two parts: to provide students in under-resourced schools with talented and dedicated teachers, that's the educational mission, and to influence the consciousness of the core members themselves so that they will assume leadership roles throughout their lives. So they are expecting that the experience of Teach for America will promote ongoing civic engagement, will increase the civic mindedness of the core members. Okay? So that's consistent with this assumption that I'm talking about, this generalized assumption that youth service, youth activism makes citizens, has long-term civic effects. Freedom Summer, that is the book Freedom Summer that I wrote, is routinely cited as evidence to support this assumption. And every time I read the citation, I cringe, because there's nothing typical about Freedom Summer. You know, the idea that this is your run-of-the-mill youth service where 4 people are killed. So I always recoil from those kind of citations, and I am skeptical that youth service routinely, or youth activism routinely, produces the kind of enduring effects that we saw in the case of Freedom Summer. That's really why I wanted to do the study. I think there's very good reason to be skeptical about that generalized assumption, and especially in relationship to the comparison between Freedom Summer and Teach for America. 3 reasons to be skeptical of this kind of generalized assumption that youth activism, youth service promotes ongoing civic engagement. The first point, in general, the meaning and long-term impact of any youth service or youth activist experience is really shaped by historical context. Freedom Summer occurred at a very pregnant moment in U.S. history. This is summer of 1964. The 60s wave, politically and counterculturally, is building. And the volunteers, Freedom Summer volunteers, are going to essentially grab a hold of that wave and they're going to ride it forward. A lot of the impact of Freedom Summer is not just about what happened in that summer. It's about a process that started there, but carried forward because of the historical context. You follow? Teach for America took place, or continues to take place, in a very different America, at a very different time. And that has shaped the experience, the Teach for America experience, in very different ways than Freedom Summer. I'll come back and talk about the importance of historical context in relationship to the 2 projects later on. But let me offer one more example to kind of underscore this first bullet point about the importance of historical context. In the context of the debates around bowling alone, 2 military sociologists, there's actually a little teeny subfield within sociology where the military service is studied. And 2 military sociologists appeared at a hearing in Washington on the fate of American civic life or something like that, and said, you want to restore social capital, you want to promote citizenship, easy. restore the draft, restore selective service, make military service more or less mandatory. Nothing creates citizenship, creates citizens more than military service. What war do you think they had in mind? World War II. They were World War II veterans. And in fact, World War II had powerful civic effects. There's no question, because of the popular understanding of what the war was about and what it meant. So it shaped the experience of the veterans who came home to a grateful nation and offered GI Bills and, you know, I've had a graduate student who did a dissertation looking at rates of civic engagement by veterans and non-veterans for two other wars, Vietnam and the first Gulf War. No effect or a negative effect. It's not that the generic experience of military service always has the same impact. Wars are not interchangeable. The meaning and longer-term impact of military service varies from period to period in war to war. So that's one reason to be skeptical. You've got to understand what the nature of the activist or service experience was in context, in historical context, number one. Second, very simply, there is extraordinary selection into TFA, which should make us skeptical about life-transforming effects, right? TFA is not absolutely unique in this respect. Lots of service experiences self-select those who are already inclined to service. But TFA is off the charts in this regard. Last year, and I may not get the numbers exactly right, but they received something like 20,000 applications, and they selected. And those 20,000 are not random graduating seniors, right? They're already those who are inclined to service. And of those 20,000, they selected 3,000. So the most active of the most active of the most active. Where do you go from there, right? I look at the original applications and I'm just ashamed of myself. You know, these folks are wildly more civically engaged than I am. So you're going, and we're going to transform them into, I'm not sure what. It's not clear where they could go from where they started. So why should we think it's going to have these big effects? So that's the second reason for skepticism. The third reason is a general reason that applies to a fairly large literature that kind of hovers between a little bit in psychology, going into psychology, some in sociology, some in political science, and some literature on civic engagement and civic education. And again, people have asked this question, so what are the longer-term civic effects of this experience? And then they do studies, and they literally have adopted the language of drug treatments. So in case of Teach for America, I told you about the three groups I had, three groups of subjects I had. So the graduates received the full TFA treatment, right? The dropouts got partial treatment. And the non-matriculants were the placebo group who got no treatment. But they use this language seriously. Folks, this analogy is so badly strained. Drug trials are carefully controlled experiments where dosage is regulated in relationship to weight and so forth, right? So you really are comparing very different groups, and those in each of the groups are essentially homogeneous, right? Real-world civic or activist experiences are not carefully controlled drug trials. Let me give you an example from Freedom Summer. The structure of the Freedom Summer Project there were 44 projects in Mississippi and Louisiana that summer. They ranged from these two extremes. One group went to Biloxi, Mississippi on the Gulf Coast. And they were called the White Citizens Project. I think that was the name of the group. They went to what was seen, legitimately as the most moderate part of the state, the Gulf Coast, where there was a lot of tourism, to try to make contact with white moderates in Mississippi in 1964 to establish dialogue. That was the goal of this particular project in Biloxi. They walked the streets of Biloxi for 3 days looking for white moderates. Having found none, they spent the rest of the summer on the beach. that literally was their project. Okay? At the other extreme, in Macomb, Mississippi, the most dangerous part of the state where the Klan was extraordinarily active, I have a roster that got posted on the wall of the Freedom House where the volunteers lived communally in Macomb. And it had chores, cooking, cleaning. I don't remember what all the chores were, except for one column that says Dynamite Watch. And this isn't, they weren't kidding. The Freedom House was bombed 75 times that summer. And if you had Dynamite Watch, your job was to stay awake in 2-hour shifts, and if somebody lobbed dynamite at the Freedom House, if you thought you could get there and throw it away from the house, that was your job. Or you just, more likely, you just alerted everybody to take cover. On the beach in Biloxi, Dynamite Watch in Macomb. Drug trials. No, they're different. There's huge differences, obviously, in any real-world activist or service experience. So there's all sorts of reasons to be skeptical of the idea that any kind of youth service or activism, of course, produces effects. What we should be expecting is variation and try to understand the nature of that variation. All right. This is my one attempt to pull an image in. I was very proud that I accomplished this, so let's all look at it. Thank you for appreciating that image. This is actually from Freedom Summer. And we'll very quickly look at, again, some findings from that study. Let me tell you briefly, though, how the study came about, because it's the coolest example of serendipity in research I know of. I had written an earlier book on the civil rights movement, and in the course of researching that book, I got really, I kept running across these references to kind of major activists in other New Left movements, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, the student movement, etc., who sort of cut their teeth in the civil rights movement, were first active in the civil rights movement, and then went on to play important roles in some of the other struggles that were characteristic of the period. And I got really interested in just how common that was. And I said, for my next project, what I really want to do is try to figure out a way to essentially study this systematically. I want to find out how common it was that individuals who were active in the civil rights movement went on to play important roles in other New Left struggles. But I was trying to think, well, how am I going to do this work systematically? And that's what led me to Freedom Summer, because 1,000 primarily white Northern college students went to Mississippi. I thought, well, if I can find them, if I get a list of who went, then I can track them down in the mid-'80s and I can find out something about their subsequent biographies. Follow. So I went to a whole slew of libraries and archives, mostly in the South, but not entirely. The State Historical Society of Wisconsin has a spectacular set of archives on New Left activism. And everywhere I went, the librarians and the archivists said the same thing. Oh, that project was pulled together very quickly. I've never seen any such list. And what I wanted, by the way, was a list, not just with names, but with the schools they were at the time. Because my thought was I'd track them back through alumni associations. Okay, which, I'll get there, never mind. So I went looking for this list, and it's a list. And everywhere the answer was the same. I really literally had almost given up, but I was at the Martin Luther King Jr. Center in Atlanta, and I asked the head archivist there the same question. Her answer was the same. Well, I haven't seen any such list, but there's uncatalogued materials in the back room, and you're welcome to look at them. I went into the back room, I opened the first box, and there's the original applications. 5 pages of data on these folks before summer. 5 pages of data in alphabetical order. Thank you very much. And I worked through, I was sitting there just going, no one's touching this. You know, like if she came and said, is there anything there? No, absolutely nothing here. You don't want to tell anybody else about this. Don't waste their time. So I worked my way through, hands trembling, and I got to the end of the alphabetical range, and then there was another set of applications also in alphabetical order. And I went, is it possible that one of these batches are people who applied, were accepted, and went, and the other are people who applied, were accepted, and didn't go? And that's exactly what it was. So that's not the study I thought I was going to do. But you're darn right, that's the study I did. So I spent then the next year and a half tracking these folks down, and I did go through alumni associations, and there's no way I'd be allowed to do this study now in that way. There's just no way. But I would write to alumni offices, and I'd get handwritten notes back. Oh, I remember Pam. Yes, oh, here's her address. Again, there were 220 schools that sent volunteers, and 3 said they wouldn't cooperate. And I think they were violating privacy laws even at the time. I do, but they did. It was also, I sat in the Tucson Public Library and looked through phone directories, and it's amazing because I had on the applications their home address in 1963. And it's amazing how many parents were still at that address in 84, 85 when I was doing this research. In any case, that's how I tracked folk down, among the ways I tracked. All right, so having found these applications for these 2 groups, the volunteers and the no-shows, the nature of the project changed, and the question became what impact did going, not going have on the applicants' lives? And the answer is it absolutely altered the biographies of both groups. The 2 groups look virtually identical on the eve of the summer, and their biographies diverged very sharply after the summer. Go through these quickly. Politically, first political differences. In that crucial period of 64 to 70, the volunteers are much, much more active in the other movements of the period. Often, as I say, pioneering these struggles, really being among the key early activists in the women's movement in particular, and the anti-war movement to a lesser extent, the student movement absolutely on the Berkeley campus, the returning Freedom Summer volunteers were central to the struggle, Mario Savio being the titular leader, and of course he had been in Macomb doing dynamite watch that summer. Okay, so volunteers are also more likely to work as paid activists, again, much more likely to say they worked as paid activists during this period. When I caught up with them in the mid-'80s, there was a kind of generalized media sort of theme that the volunteer, the 60s activists, where are they today? They all sold out. They're now the yuppies of today. That may be true for some who were marginally active. That wasn't true for these folks at all. It never made much sense sociologically to imagine people who had committed this deeply would be very, very different 20 years later. But remember, the mid-'80s, this is the middle of the Reagan years. So the feel in the country is very different. The volunteers, however, remained far more, not liberal, leftist in their political attitudes, really shaded far left, even in the mid-'80s. They were also remained very active in liberal left social movements, often local activism, but they were also very involved in opposing U.S. foreign policy in Central America, for instance. I was quite struck at how consistent their attitudes and kind of political behaviors were 20 years later in a very different time and place in this country's history. Personally, and this wasn't something I was imagining I'd look into, but the personal differences were so striking as well. First, the volunteers at the time I did the research in the mid-'80s were much less likely to be married than the no-shows. They were not less likely to have ever married. In fact, there was no difference in that regard. But less than half of them were were married in the mid-80s as compared to about 75% of the no-shows. So very significant difference. The two groups generally went into the same broad occupational fields, broadly the helping professions, but the specific jobs they took could not have been more different. So lots went into law. But if you were a volunteer, you were very likely to be doing poverty law, or you'd be a public defender, you'd be in some relatively less prestigious, less well remunerated corner of the legal profession as compared to the no-shows. And as a result, they had much lower incomes. In general, they had much more episodic, non-traditional work careers. The differences were really striking. The broad conclusion, again, to oversimplify a little, is that the volunteers really committed to the movement, in the aggregate, committed to the movement as a result of their experiences in Mississippi that summer, and kind of organized their lives around politics. And it had impacted their personal histories, their work choices, occupational choices, etc. The no-shows really felt, when I interviewed them and surveyed them, they felt much more like pretty conventional liberals. They really were liberals. They were left of center politically. They were still more politically aware than their age peers. But they had lived pretty conventional lives in occupational and family terms. And that wasn't true for the volunteers. Okay, so let's dig into the Teach for America research a little bit. I told you about the origins of the study, the conversation I had with Kappa. I talked about these three groups of applicants: graduates, dropouts, non-matriculants. And let's look. And again, these are survey results. We had hoped to do survey work and then go out and do interviews, but we never got funding support for that latter piece. So unfortunately, we never got a chance to talk to our subjects in the same way I did in Freedom Summer. I had a Guggenheim grant that allowed me to drive around the country for a year in my little Subaru, staying with these folks and having a grand time. Okay, so we'll start with attitudes, and there were lots of attitudinal items on the survey. These are just absolutely illustrative. I mean, they're not picked for any particular reason, but they illustrate the general pattern. Consistently, about 75% of the attitudinal items, the graduates are slightly more other regarding, civic regarding, than the other two groups. They're all off the charts in their attitudinal embrace of civic life and service and so forth. But the graduates are slightly more. And the differences are statistically significant. So at first blush, by looking at the attitudinal evidence, it looks like, okay, TFA is in fact having the effect that one might expect. So let's set that aside and look at behaviors. Behaviors are quite different. So here down the left-hand side, you have types of service activity. Education-related service, not through TFA. And again, this is contemporary service. It's what they are engaged in now at the time of filling out the survey. So education-related service, not through TFA. Total education-related service, that's the sum of TFA and other education-related service. Service in any other area other than education, any kind of service whatsoever. And all we're doing over here is comparing the three groups in terms of the proportion reporting doing any service in that category and the mean number of service activities in that category. We also have hourly estimates, and that data looks essentially like these two metrics that I'm showing in this particular table. So in education-related service, not through Teach for America, the only difference here is that the non-matriculants are more active than the graduates and the dropouts. That's all. Total education-related service, not surprisingly, the graduates are more active than the other two groups. That is not a big surprise. The main source of their contemporary service or civic commitment is through TFA, which we don't list here because it wouldn't be meaningful. They're the only ones who are doing service to TFA. But they rank highest in total education-related service because of their ongoing involvement with TFA. Service in any other area other than education, the graduates rank well behind the dropouts and non-matriculants, not surprisingly perhaps. Any kind of service whatsoever, the non-matriculants rank higher than the other two, and that difference is statistically significant. Okay? It's not big differences, but again, the graduates are not, the ones who have the TFA treatment are not more active than the other two groups. In fact, the group that's most active are non-matriculants, and we'll see that is the dominant pattern. Okay, this is, you don't have to pay huge attention. Now we're looking not in the bivariate sense, but in the multivariate sense, and I just call your attention to the one kind of highlighted bar here. The group that's left out of the analysis for comparison purposes are the non-matriculants. So they're in the analysis, they are the point of comparison for graduates and dropouts. Any education service, the only finding of note here is that dropouts are wildly less likely to be engaged in education-related service. That's not surprising. They tried TFA and fled in horror. And not a TFA. They found themselves woefully unequipped to be in the classroom, and so they fled. But they didn't stop being active, but they certainly didn't want to re-up in another similar education situation. Non-TFA education service, both the graduates and dropouts rank far behind the non-matriculants in any other kind of education service. Other service, non-education service, the graduates rank much, much lower than the other two groups. And any current service, both the graduates and dropouts are engaged in less service, statistically speaking, than the non-matriculants. Okay? That's the same thing. We asked them, that's one way we tried to get at this issue of current or contemporary service or civic involvement, but we had a whole bunch of other items on the survey. We asked the two groups to estimate their level of involvement in three other kinds of civic activity or political activity: sort of conventional civic activity, institutional politics, social movement participation. These were their own estimates, obviously, but the dropouts rate themselves as more active in those three kinds of civic participation, as more active in those three kinds of civic participation than the graduates. The only difference between graduates and non-matriculants is that middle category, institutional politics. The graduates also lag behind the other two groups in charitable giving, voting, and pro-social employment. And this one is really interesting because when we started, the first talks I gave out of this data didn't include anything on pro-social employment because we had very complicated work histories for the three groups, and we were coding it. We were trying to figure out a coding scheme by which we could determine which of their positions we would consider pro-social employment. Follow? So that required a lot of additional coding and analysis. So I was reporting all the other differences, and TFA got in touch with us. They weren't very happy about the findings. And they said, well, this is a stupid study because you missed the whole point, because our graduates are in fact so committed to civic involvement, service, that they've taken pro-social jobs, and your survey doesn't even look at that. So I said, well, it does, but that's coming. Give us a little bit of time. Same pattern. In fact, it's stronger. The non-matriculants are wildly higher. Dropouts are significantly higher in pro-social employment than the graduates. Graduates rank dead last by a large margin. So it just isn't the case. So, again, and now I always have to add this parenthetical aside. These three groups are all off the charts. Again, I said they vote in lower numbers, and it's true that the graduates' rate of voting in voter participation is lower. It's like 88%. Okay, the non-matriculants are like 95%. So These folks are off the charts, as you would expect given where they were before they applied. If you just tracked ahead, you'd imagine they would have these kind of profiles. But, so despite all these very high levels of participation in these various categories, the pattern is really unmistakable. The non-matriculants outpace everybody. The dropouts tend to rank second. Did I say that right? Non-matriculants highest, dropouts second, and the graduates tend to bring up the rear in all of these categories. So then it creates a puzzle. Well, their attitudes are more civic engaging, but their behavior's less so. So what's going on? Well, here's another take on the whole attitudinal issue. And this pattern was really strong across virtually every service attitudinal item. So now we've divided the graduates into two groups. Graduates not involved in TFA service, and graduates who remain involved with TFA in the present. That's where the attitudinal difference comes from. Now, that could owe to, you could explain that one of two ways. Either you could imagine that those who remain involved with TFA were so powerfully impacted by the experience that it increased their attitudinal commitment, and that's why they remain involved. Possible. I think this is simply a reflection of the TFA organizational culture. TFA is a very unique organization. It feels almost more like a social movement when you visit the organization, which is, I count as a positive thing. But there's a lot of talking the talk. And I think the other way to explain the difference is that these are folks who remain embedded in a distinctive organizational culture that prizes the talk. And the walk as well, don't get me wrong, but prizes the talk. So these differences are an expression of the ongoing embedding in that particular organizational culture. I can't prove it with the data, but that's the interpretation I would offer. So there maybe isn't quite as much of a difference between the attitudes and the behaviors here. Okay, how do we account for these wildly different events, TFA versus Freedom Summer? And let me just offer a little bit of speculation and then wrap up and open it up to questions and comments from you guys. The first thing I would mention that I think is really important when you think about any youth activist, youth service experience is this gap between expectation and reality. And this gets back to the whole issue of historical context. Who were the Freedom Summer volunteers? These are not baby boomers. These are people born in 40, 41, 42, they're pre-boomers. They're not growing up in the 60s. They're really children of the 50s more than they are the 60s. And this is a very interesting time in American history. These folks grew up at a kind of with a very generally pretty idealized, positive image of the United States. They were trying to sort of express that sort of commitment to service to America through Freedom Summer. A couple other points. These are also these are very privileged individuals. These are not middle-class kids. The SNCC in organizing the project, their goal was to bring the media to Mississippi. So they reasoned, we want to move from the elite institutions. We want to bring the sons and daughters of white privilege to Mississippi. That was really the goal. The 5 schools that sent the largest numbers, not per capita maybe, but the largest absolute numbers, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Berkeley. Okay, sent almost half. Okay? So these are upper middle, upper class kids raised in the 40s and 50s who came away with who generally had a very positive view of the United States. The United States was not just the most powerful country in the world, it was morally the best country in the world. And they were now aware that there were problems in the South, and they were going to correct those problems. They also had this extraordinary sense of kind of generational possibility. I don't know what else to call it. There was one page on the application, an open-ended item that simply said, why do you want to work in Mississippi this summer? And one answer by a second-year law student at Harvard at the time was, I want to work in Mississippi this summer to end the scourge of racial discrimination once and for all so we can get back to the business of ending world hunger in the fall. There's a to-do list. Racial discrimination, done. Finished it by mid-July. World hunger, December. I mean, reading these applications was time travel. So again, there was this extraordinary gap between expectation and reality in what they found, the America they found in Mississippi. When let me do one other story. So when I actually start to do this research, I'm tracking down the volunteers, and I'm a struggling assistant professor, and I don't have funding support for this research. And I didn't want to stack the deck, so I had already gathered the surveys. I got all the surveys back. And I said, okay, I'm going to select 40 volunteers and 40 no-shows at random. And then I'm going to go try to interview them. So I drew the samples, and I was hoping that there'd be some geographic clustering, because the only way I could think to do this would be parachute into a city, get into some cheap motel, and race around and try to interview. So here's a factoid for you. What percent of the applicants in 1963-64 do you think their home address was California? Or, sorry, Bay Area, not California. What percent? Just hazard in 63-64. Yeah, a little high, but about 11%. What percent do you think it was in the mid-80s? Just under half. It's the giant sucking sound of the 60s pulling these folks to California. So I went, oh my God, this is great. The Bay Area is a great place to be in the summer. I have a family. So anyway, I went to the Bay Area. I still was absolutely intent on keeping expenses low. I had my cars and race around. I said, well, how many interviews can I do in a day? What do you what seems reasonable? 3. Okay, I get one at 9. Maybe it lasts, the same meeting goes 2 hours. So 11. I get them for an hour, I take field notes, I go off, I have lunch, take field notes over lunch, get to another one, 2 even, 2 to 4, break for dinner, field notes, and do one in the evening. Seems reasonable, right? Here's literally the first interview. I show up at a house, I'm met at the door by an elderly couple crying. And a middle-aged woman behind them screaming at them. And first I think I'm at the wrong place, and then I realized, no, they're screaming, and over like an hour of torture, kind of family drama. Here's the story that comes out. So the woman, the middle-aged woman, is my subject. She's the woman I come to interview. The elderly couple are her parents who've flown in from Pennsylvania to stop the interview. And they say, let's tell you what happened when she came home from Freedom Summer. Let us tell you the full story first, they say. So she finished her junior year at Beaver College in Pennsylvania, which, good move on their part, is no longer called Beaver College. Good move. It's Arcadia College, but small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania, Beaver College. And this woman is very religious. And spring break 1963, she goes to Raleigh, North Carolina to do voter registration with her church group. And she has a powerful experience. This is social gospel in action. She's putting her faith to work. She finds it very rewarding, and she signs on for Freedom Summer. She comes home at the end of the summer. She takes, and they all recount this, she takes a cross from around her neck and throws it at her parents. Says, my church lied to me, my teachers lied to me, you lied to me.
She walks out of the house. They don't see her again until 1980. 16 years. She said, and the mother, through tears, says, and now you come around stirring this all up again. So they kind of reestablished contact, but it was still tense, and here I come. And being the sensitive guy I am, I said, I got a tight time schedule here. Come on, people, work with me. No, so what happened is that interview took 2 days. This is the only way that it happened. They agreed that I could interview her alone. Then I would interview them alone. And then we'd do family therapy on day 2, which is exactly what we did. When I sat down to interview her, she said, can I read this poem? And she read this poem that had these gut-wrenching images. Pasty white skin, black skin, green kudzu vines, these kind of visceral, with blood on the street was the other. And I said, God, did you write that summer? I wrote it last night. Okay, I gotta get back to my home planet. Expectation and reality. Sheltered, again, growing up, not in the 60s, growing up in the 40s and 50s, with a very idealized image of the United States. What she found in Mississippi, she couldn't reconcile it with her expectations. If you are talking about any kind of service or activist experience where the gap between the expectations about the experience and the reality are huge, you can count on big effects. These folks, for all their wonderful virtues, they were incredibly naive. Teach for America teachers are generally not very naive. They've grown up with a lot more information about the United States. They have a much more realistic sense of what they're getting into. So that gap is much lower, much smaller, sorry. Second, radical resocialization in the case of Food Summer, but not TFA. That is, the volunteers went south and they found themselves generally in communal situations where the leaders of their projects were hardened SNCC veterans. These were among the most charismatic activist figures in the 60s. And they were already very radicalized, and they were intent on radicalizing the volunteers from the North, telling them what their country was really like. So again, and the other thing I want to emphasize, this is a communal situation. In some ways, if you wanted to change people, you couldn't design a project that would do it better, right? They're living communally, interacting intensively. The feel in these houses must have just been electric and intense. And you've got these charismatic black activists or field secretaries in SNCC with a very radical perspective on the U.S., and they are communicating it to the volunteers. And oh yes, there's a hostile white audience, or a hostile white community out there. So they feel very much in a kind of Fort Apache situation, and they're interacting intensively. The reality for Teach for America teachers is that, for the most part, you're slogging through this as a first-time teacher. This is a highly individual experience. You're up at 2 in the morning going, what am I going to talk about tomorrow? What's my lesson plan? You follow? I mean, you couldn't, these experiences are totally different. So this dimension is, generic question about service experience or activist experience. How communal is it? How individual is it? More communal, more potential for change. To what extent is there a conscious effort to re-socialize people kind of politically? To what extent is the project organized around a kind of alternative perspective on politics, say? Yes, in the case of Freedom Summer, no, in the case of Teach for America. I won't even go into the third one. You can talk, there are other differences we could point to, but again, all I want to leave you with is this idea that we have to give up on this notion that any kind of youth service or youth activism will change people. Most of the time it won't, and we have to look at these experiences comparatively and try to identify those features or dynamic processes that may help us understand long-term. Without that, we pushing our students, our kids, into settings that have very little impact on them long term. I'll stop there and take questions. Sorry to be so long-winded.
I have a question.
Yes.
Out of the people that you interviewed, the ones who ended up going to the summer and the ones who didn't end up going, which ones do you think seemed happier people?
That's a great question. In general, those who didn't know. It was one of the hardest things as a researcher. And it's the reason I believe deeply in sort of mixed methods. This is in the social sciences is a big deal. I had all the surveys, right? And the surveys told a very stark story that yes, the volunteers were still, you know, they were still true to the politics they espoused 20 years earlier in both attitudes and behaviors. And so the surveys told one story. It really said that those who had committed to Freedom Summer, again, looked like they'd been pretty radical about the experience and were still true to the politics that they had embraced 20 years ago. That's essentially kind of the punchline from the surveys. And I told colleagues that I was going to go out and interview folks. I'm going to spend a year and a half doing it. And they said, oh my God, why do you do that? I mean, you have all the surveys, just mine the data, you know, publish it. And I said, well, you know, I can't believe I actually, I'm asking about pretty deep issues. You know, what did that summer, what impact did it have on you, and who are you now? The idea that you can pull that off the survey data. So I said, I've got to do the interviews. And that very first interview I just mentioned, I was reeling, going, oh my God. I had another one like 2 days later that in its own way was more powerful. And I wasn't prepared for this. I didn't really fully understand the stuff that we're talking about here. I'm born 10 years later, 12 years later than most of the Freedom Summer volunteers. So I cut into the 60s very, very much later. So I don't know what it meant, what it felt like to grow up in an upper middle or upper class home when I turned 20 in 1960. I couldn't even imagine what that was given when I was born. But I was starting to learn it from these interviews. And one of the things that I would have to, when you asked a great question, in my heart of hearts, at the end of it, I found the volunteers wildly more interesting, but very churned up still, that they had really, again, when they climbed on that wave in '64, it was a great ride, but the wave crested at some point and washed them up on the beach in 1984 with Reagan at the White House. They were going, holy crap. I mean, they really felt that they had paid a very significant price for this particular ride. So, your question's very good.
Yeah, kind of building on that, it seems to me, what if you decide to stay committed to being in the trenches? I mean, that's a hard place to be for a long journey, and they're alienated from their families, potentially, as in the case of your story, or from society more generally in certain ways, and that's a harder. It's hard to stay in that place where you're at odds with your surrounding community. And so I was curious, thinking about Freedom Summer versus other social movements in the 60s. It's been way too long since I've read anything in this area, but I'm thinking of like Kenneth Keniston's work on young radicals and so-called red diaper babies and whatnot. And you've got a different cohort, it seems to me, going into other movements that where they do really have parental support. Now, maybe they go beyond where their parents were, but a lot of them have old Marxist parents who it wouldn't be such a disconnect. And so, as you were describing the process, it seemed to me their kind of active choice of selecting these kind of children of privilege is part of what made it such a jarring disjuncture between expectation and reality. but maybe not. I don't know.
Yes and no. No, what you just, the point you ended on is absolutely true. In class terms, absolutely. But these are amazingly advantaged kids. There was another question, and I didn't understand what they were trying to do with this question, and then I realized what was going on. There was a page that simply said, list 10 adults, I think it said, adults that you want to be kept informed of summer events. What's that about? Remember, the intent was to bring the media. So on the application, it also said, what's your local newspaper? What's the biggest metro daily? What's your local radio station? What's the local network affiliate nearest to your house? They also, and these were still in these packets, were 4 yearbook photos. You know, I mean, really they clearly had asked for that. So their idea was when Susie gets arrested, we're going to send all this information out to all these outlets. They didn't have to do that because the first week of the project, 3 volunteers were kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. So the media descended on Mississippi. So they didn't have to orchestrate much of a publicity campaign. It was in motion all summer long. But in any case, the list of 10, I would read it and I go, this is just unbelievable. They're listening to people that they probably think are famous, and I guess they want to know those. Like they'd say, I'm really trying to think, Douglas Dillon. No one will know who Douglas Dillon was. Does anyone know? Secretary of Treasury. Exactly, I know. That's kind of silly, yeah, and they're trying to reach the elite. And then I see that he's an uncle. No, I'm serious. The connections were unbelievable. So these guys were stitched into the fabric of upper class America. In that sense, what you're saying is absolutely true. What is not true is their parents were overwhelmingly supportive in attitudinal terms. Now that doesn't mean they wanted them to go to Mississippi. So many of them said, I don't know these guys at home, and I thought when I told my parents I was going, I thought they'd be thrilled. And they said, you absolutely are not going, young lady, or something. So in that sense, there was some degree of conflict, although I also had 2 other groups of parents show up at interviews, not to block the interview, but to take credit for their daughter or son going, and they brought scrapbooks and they wanted me to interview them. So this is very consistent with Keniston. That's the general image of the 60s. Oh, it's generational conflict. They learned these values at home. Overwhelmingly, they felt their parents' values were what had motivated them in the first place. Okay? So in that sense, there wasn't that kind of tension. But in class terms, you're absolutely right. They didn't know this America existed. I can tell you another story, but I'll spare it, but it's a doozy. You can't do that.
Doug, how do you explain the rise of a service learning requirement in schools, high schools, and colleges? And do you think it is, in fact, an ignorant notion?
No. I don't think it's an ignorant notion. And I think it's a 60s impact. I think that in general, the folks who have advocated for what, in value terms, I think is a great idea, tend to be kind of progressive, education reformers who want to build engaged kind of community service into the curriculum. I think that's a great impulse. All I'm saying is let's not kid ourselves about that impact. My daughter is wildly service-oriented, activist-oriented. She hated her community service requirement in high school. And yet her counselor said, this is good for you. This will make you a citizen. And she's going, I may just, it made her, it had exactly the opposite effect. So, again, in attitudinal terms, I embrace this, the attempt to build
community service, civic engagement, service learning. I'm very involved at Stanford trying to promote those things. But I think in many instances, most instances, the way we implement those programs has very little power to actually impact people in any kind of enduring way. So that's all I would say. Yeah.
Well, that being said, it seemed as though the TFA was denying your results in a way, but is there some practical lesson that TFA should learn from what you learned that maybe could be applied to every service organization, the Peace Corps or whatever might be out there? That would make it better.
We came up, we had some findings. I imagined when we did the research that there would be a time when we would sit down with Indian lieutenants and talk this through. And they've been so upset about the results that we never had that conversation. I don't think our results have any, transformative, we don't have any transformative recommendations, but for instance, one of the things we have tried to look at, we don't get big sort of variance explained, but it's still, what we try to explain is dropping out. So why, this is a costly thing for TFA, and it's a costly thing for the schools who hire those teachers. Most of the dropouts are not dropping out at the end of the school year, they're dropping out somewhere in the school year. This disrupts classes, this disrupts the lives of students. It's a PR nightmare for TFA. So we've looked at it, and we can't explain much of the variance, but we do have 3 or 4 things that have significant effects. And we thought, well, we could pass this on, and maybe this would be useful, but we never had that opportunity. So, yeah.
I applied.
Good for you.
Thanks. But I was assured that teacher Merkel will be coming to Ohio in the next few years. We'll see.
Well, we'll say again.
That teacher Merkel will be coming to Ohio in the next few years. I didn't actually.
I think it will.
That's what they assured me, so I wasn't sure. But I also was just curious that I'm not upset, though I don't know what Wendy was, but by the findings, because I do feel that I'm already service oriented. I don't think that a program like this, it allows me to exercise my interest in service, but I don't think that it's going to make me, any different about it. So I actually agree. But I am curious as to see that since a lot of the graduates did not go into service oriented careers, did you find what they did go into, or did you see what?
Yeah, I mean, we got pretty thorough work histories, family histories, etc. There wasn't any one thing, and again, a very large percentage, I think, are doing for social employment, not the majority at all. I don't even remember what those numbers look like. Something like a third maybe, which is still very high, but not as high as non-matriculants or the dropouts. A number of the Teach for America graduates that we did pre-test interviews, but then never got the opportunity to do systematic interviews. I know a lot of Teach for America graduates, and a lot of them say, at the end of the 2 years, I was toast. I was exhausted. And I had kind of watched my age peers move on, and I was intent, at least for a while, to catch up. And the other thing that surprised us a little bit is that, in general, the modal TFA graduate does not get supported by their parents. Not in attitudinal terms. They say, oh, my parents totally value these attitudes, but they say, why are you throwing away your education? And so I felt like I needed to show them that I was going to get on with my life and, have a high status career. So that's some of it, is that they feel like they made a huge contribution, which I think they have, and they kind of want to re-engage a kind of more normal life, and maybe partly to, again, please parents, and you follow. There's something else I was going to say. Shoot, that's a great question. And, I know. I don't understand why these results are upsetting. These folks remain incredibly active. They're just not as active as these other groups. The other thing that I'm always anxious to say is, because the bigger controversy around TFA is an educational service. And I say, look, this has nothing to do with that.
I'm not an expert, I can't assess the effectiveness of the TFA program educationally. My gut admires the hell out of it. I'm just a fan, again, uneducated, without data to support it, but in general, I say this is a powerful organization. I applaud what they're trying to do educationally. My question is very narrow, and it's about the enduring civic effects, period. So I hope they do come to Ohio in that sense, and you follow through on that.